Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bells so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about the solved case of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Peña. They were two teenage girls, two friends, who went to a party one night in mid-1993 and never returned home. After they left the party, the girls just disappeared and their family spent the next few days frantically trying to find them, desperately hoping that they would be found alive. But sadly, they wouldn't be. Eventually, their bodies were found and both girls had been horrifically murdered. And it would be the killer's own arrogance and need to brag about what they had done that would ultimately lead to them being identified as the murderers. Before we get into the case, please listen carefully to the following. This video is about the brutal murders of two teenage girls and it involves heavy themes such as violence towards women, torture, sexual assault and rape. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back almost 3 decades now to the summer of 1993 in Oak Forest, which is an area located in northwest Houston in Texas in the US. And this is Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Peña. They were two friends who lived in Houston with their families. So let's talk a little bit more about them, about who Jennifer and Elizabeth were, starting with Jennifer. So Jennifer was 14 years old at the time that this case took place. She was born on the 15th of August 1978 and her parents were called Randy and Sandra Ertman. And Randy and Sandra were just completely over the moon when Jennifer was born because they really wanted a baby, but they were always a little bit worried that they might have some trouble with conceiving because I think they were starting to enter their late 30s when they had Jennifer, which I guess is considered a geriatric pregnancy. So yeah, when Jennifer came along, they were just so incredibly happy. She was everything that they had ever wanted. Her parents described Jennifer as being quite a sensitive and modest young girl, but with a great sense of humour. She was really funny and fun to be around, and her father Randy said that she just had the best laugh. She was very well behaved growing up. Her parents only had to tell her off and shout at her for misbehaving a couple of times. She always did very well in school. She would get high marks in tests and exams, and she also had a lot of friends too, one of which was obviously Elizabeth Peña. They both attended the same high school. They went to the Waltrip High School in Houston, and that's where they met. They met in school. Elizabeth Peña was slightly older than Jennifer. By the time this case occurred, she had literally just turned 16. She was born on the 21st of June 1977 to parents Adolf and Melissa Peña, and Elizabeth was the oldest of 3 children. She had a little brother named Michael and a little sister named Rachel. Growing up, Elizabeth was very much a girly girl. She loved wearing dresses and dressing up in different clothes, and when she was 10 years old and her baby sister Rachel came along, she was so excited. She and her little brother Michael were a lot closer in age. I think Elizabeth was only 2 when Michael was born, so they didn't always get along so well. They would bicker and argue as siblings do. But her parents said that when Rachel, the youngest, came along, Elizabeth was just besotted with her. All she wanted to do was help her mum and dad look after her. It was like Rachel was almost her little baby in a way. As Elizabeth got older, she made a lot of friends in school and she did pretty well in school. Her father said that she was really intelligent but a little bit lazy when it came to studying. If she really tried, she probably could have gotten all A's, but she wasn't too bothered about getting the highest marks. If she could get a C and pass, she was happy with that. So she would kind of study enough so that she knew she would get at least a C, which is fair enough. And she was described by loved ones as being very loving. She was kind and caring, but she was also just goofy. She was silly and fun. But then when she was in her early teenage years, around like 14 years old, her parents noticed that Elizabeth started to rebel a little bit. I think just because she became friends with a few kids who perhaps weren't the best influence on her. They were quite naughty in school. They would get in trouble a lot, and this kind of rubbed off on Elizabeth. She began sneaking out of the house at night to go and see these friends. She would come home late, and I believe she was even kicked out of school for bad behaviour. But it was when she started out at a new school, Waltrip High School, that she decided to have a fresh start. She made some new friends, one of which was Jennifer Ertman, and she just kind of got her life back on track. She started behaving again, and she just went back to being that good kid that she always was growing up. And Elizabeth's parents actually believed that Jennifer had a lot to do with that. They believed that Jennifer really had such a positive influence on Elizabeth because Jennifer was so nice and polite, and that started to rub off on Elizabeth. And so they were so happy that the two had become really great friends. And the girls were happy. They were just your typical teenage girls who worked hard in school, had fun with friends, and were looking forward to their futures. However, they were futures that neither Jennifer nor Elizabeth would actually get to see, because in mid-1993, both girls would be brutally attacked and murdered one summer's night. The date was the 24th of June 1993, and that afternoon, around 4:15 p.m, Jennifer's father Randy drove his daughter to her friend Elizabeth's house because they were going to go to a party together that evening, a pool party which was being held at their friend Gina's house. So Randy dropped Jennifer off, said goodbye, told her to make sure that she was home by her curfew, which was like 11:30 p.m/midnight, and with that she walked into Elizabeth's house. The girls stayed at Elizabeth's for a couple of hours. They were probably just getting ready, and then at approximately 8 p.m. they arrived at Gina's house, and the girls told Elizabeth's mum Melissa that they would be back home in time for their curfew. As far as I'm aware, they had a really good time at this pool party. They were having fun and laugh with friends, and then later that night they left Gina's house to go back home. However, when they did leave, they realised that they were running late. They weren't going to make it back to Elizabeth's home in time for their curfew, and so they decided to take a shortcut. Instead of walking along the normal route to Elizabeth's house, they decided to walk along this shortcut which passed through T.C. Jester Park in Oak Forest and White Oak Bayou along some railroad tracks. If they walked along this route, it would have taken them only about 10 minutes to get to Elizabeth's house. However, obviously by this time it was very late at night. It was way past 11 p.m, so it was dark outside, and I can't imagine that there were many, if any, street lights along this route. And Jennifer and Elizabeth never made it home that night. At some point during their journey, they just vanished. The following morning, so the 25th of June 1993, Jennifer's parents, Randy and Sandra, woke up and they were immediately concerned because they realised that Jennifer was not in her bed. Her bed hadn't even been slept in, so she never returned home the previous night after the pool party. From what I can gather, Jennifer was going to go back to Elizabeth's after the party, and then maybe Elizabeth's parents were going to drop her home or something, but clearly that hadn't happened. Randy and Sandra did think that maybe she had just decided to stay at Elizabeth's house, sleep there, but then at the same time, whenever she had done that before, decided to stay at a friend's house for the night, Jennifer had always made sure to let her parents know because she wouldn't want them to worry. She would always ring them and just let them know of her plans, but this time she hadn't done that, so Randy and Sandra really started to panic. But maybe it was just an honest mistake. Maybe she had just simply forgotten to ring her mum and dad, and so they decided to try and get in touch with Elizabeth's parents, Adolf and Melissa Peña, to see if Jennifer really had stayed at their house last night. However, when they rang their home phone, there was no answer. They also tried to ring Elizabeth and Jennifer's friend Gina, who was obviously hosting the pool party the night before, but they couldn't get an answer from her either. So after having no luck, Jennifer's father Randy got in his car and he drove to Elizabeth's house. However, when he knocked on the front door, no one answered it. It seemed as though no one was home. I think Elizabeth's parents might have been at work at the time, and clearly Elizabeth and Jennifer were not there either. And so later that day, Randy went to Gina's home to ask if the girls were there, but they weren't. And Gina said that she didn't know where they were. She hadn't seen them since the previous night when they left her pool party. Gina tried paging them because both Elizabeth and Jennifer had their own pagers. However, she got no response. In fact, Jennifer's parents had already tried that themselves and they got no answer too. Following this, Randy Ertman and the girl's friend Gina headed back to Elizabeth's house again to see if maybe now a few hours later someone was home, but again they got no answer from the front door. They even banged on Elizabeth's bedroom window, but still nothing. And when Randy was finally able to speak to Elizabeth's parents that afternoon, they informed him that they too had no idea where their daughter or Jennifer were. Elizabeth also hadn't returned home the previous night. I think they might have assumed the same as Jennifer's parents initially, that Elizabeth had stayed stayed at the Ertman's house, but clearly she hadn't, so they also started to panic. They also began trying to page Elizabeth, but they had no response, and no one had any idea where the girls were. Gina and the two families were reaching out to the girls' other friends, but no one had any clue where they had gone the previous night after leaving the party. It was honestly as if they had just vanished into thin air, and so that same day, the police were contacted and the girls were reported as missing. So the police began their inquiries into their disappearances, although having said that, according to a book I read about this case, the police really did not do much to help in the beginning. Apparently it took them a while to actually take this case seriously and actually start looking for the girls, which is insane considering that they were literally minors. They were 14 and 16. But the girls' families continued their own search efforts for the girls. They went out searching for them themselves. They were calling around, contacting any friends of the girls, asking if they were with them. They created missing posters with the girls' faces on them, and they distributed them around the local area, hoping that someone might see them and get in contact. And unbelievably, they received a load of prank calls during this time of idiots pretending that they had seen Jennifer and Elizabeth just to try and get their parents' hopes up, which is just vile. That honestly infuriates me. I mean, what kind of person could do something like that? It's disgusting. But of course, the parents didn't know that they were fake calls at the time, so they would follow up on these sightings and these leads, which of course never led them anywhere because they were just lies. This time for the families must have just been horrendous. They were doing everything that they could to try and find their daughters, but they were just in limbo, waiting and waiting and waiting for any news, not knowing what had happened, whether they were still alive and out there somewhere, or whether the worst had happened and they were dead. And unfortunately, days went by with no answers, with no sign of Elizabeth and Jennifer, until 4 days after they went missing, on the 28th of June 1993, when an anonymous call came in to the Crime Stoppers tip line. I believe the call was actually made the day before this, on the 27th of June. One of the Crime Stoppers operators picked up the phone, and it was a man's voice on the other end of the line. This man said that his name was Mr. Gonzalez, and he claimed to know the whereabouts of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Peña. Although he didn't actually use their names, I don't believe. He actually said, quote, "I know where you can find those dead girls." Dead girls. He then said, quote, "Right off of TC Jester next to the Bayou, White Oak Bayou." And with that, he hung up the phone. So the police started searching around this area straight away, but they didn't find anything that day. From what I can gather, this area around TC Jester Park was pretty big. There was a lot of wooded area around it, so they had a lot of ground to cover. It wasn't until the next day, the 28th of June, when the police found something. Whilst one of the officers was walking along the railway bridge in TC Jester Park towards a wooded area, as he got closer to the trees, he spotted what looked like some clothing on the ground. However, he was quite far away from it at this point, so he decided to walk closer to this area where he could see this clothing. But tragically, when he arrived, he realised that it wasn't just clothing he had found. He had actually stumbled upon two dead bodies, the bodies of two young girls. There were different bits of clothing scattered around the bodies. I believe both girls were partially nude, and instantly the police thought that these girls were probably Elizabeth Peña and Jennifer Ertman, who had been missing for days by this point. However, they couldn't actually tell this just from looking at the bodies because they were very decomposed by the time they were found. Obviously, it was June, it was summer, so it was hot and dry outside, and so naturally in these conditions a body would decompose quickly. So yeah, they were very decomposed. Animals and wildlife had begun to descend on the bodies, so the police cornered off the area as it was now a crime scene, obviously. Although by this point this discovery had gained a lot of attention. Local people noticed that a load of police were by the railway bridge in TC Jester Park, and they were intrigued as to why. I think they soon realised that two bodies had been found here here, and most people jumped straight to the conclusion that these bodies were Jennifer and Elizabeth. It had to be. They had been missing for days. It had to be them. And Jennifer Ertman's father, Randy, assumed the same. He rushed to the scene as soon as he heard about the discovery, and he was just absolutely hysterical, as you can imagine. He was desperately trying to get to the area where the bodies had been found because he just wanted to know if one of them was his daughter. He was desperate. He was crying and shouting. He had to be held back by the police because he was just trying to get to the scene, and he just kept saying, please, I need to find out if that's my daughter. Just tell me if one of them has got blonde hair. But of course the police couldn't tell him anything at this point, though I'm sure that they too strongly believed that these bodies were that of Jennifer and Elizabeth. They couldn't confirm this just yet, but eventually this was confirmed. When the victims' teeth were examined and compared to the dental records of the missing girls, the medical examiner was able to confirm that they were a match. The bodies by the railway bridge were in fact Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Peña. Now, during a post-mortem, due to the decomposition of both bodies, it was difficult to determine their cause of deaths, but the medical examiner ultimately was confident that both girls had died as the result of strangulation. They had both been murdered. At some point during their walk home, they were attacked and brutally murdered. So now the hunt was on for the police to find the person or people responsible for this horrific crime. And of course, they already had a lead. They had that phone call to Crime Stoppers from the man who literally told them where the police could find the girls' bodies. So who was this man, and did he know the location of the bodies because he perhaps had a part in the murders, or did he know someone that did have a part in the murders and they told him where the girls were? If you remember from the phone call, the man told the operator that his name was Mr. Gonzalez, which would actually turn out to be a fake name that this guy had used. But luckily, the police were able to trace the call, trace the location that it had been made from. And when they did this, they traced it to a house on Ashland Street in Houston. And this house, the police discovered, was home to the Cantu family. The owners of the house were married couple Rudy Cantu Sr. and Susie Cantu, and they had 4 children. However, the police learned that 2 of their sons lived in the house with them. Their sons' names were Peter Cantu and Joe Cantu. So after the police had this address, they went straight to the Cantu home, eager to speak to the people there to try and determine who it was that made this call, who was Mr. Gonzalez. And when they arrived, they spoke to one of the sons, Joe Cantu, and he admitted that it was him that made the phone call. He was the one who sent in the tip about where the girls' bodies could be found, but he claimed that he had nothing to do with the murders. He actually said that his brother, Peter Cantu, and some of Peter's friends had returned to the house, the Cantu house, in the early hours of the morning on the 25th of June 1993. So on the night that the girls went missing and were murdered, after they would have been murdered, and the group confessed to Joe and his wife Christina that they had just raped and murdered 2 young girls. And sickeningly, they were excited about this. They actually said that they had, quote, had fun that evening. They had enjoyed what they did to the girls, and they were telling Joe and Christina about it as if it was something that they were all proud of. They were bragging about it, as any normal people would be. Joe and Christina were horrified when they learned about what the group had done, and eventually Christina managed to convince her husband Joe to report what his brother and his friends had done to the police. I think Joe was hesitant to report it at first because he was scared. He was probably terrified that if Peter and the group found out that he had ratted them out, then they might do something to him. And so that's why Joe decided to use the fake name Mr. Gonzalez on the phone call, and why he was quite vague. He obviously didn't tell the operator about his brother's confession. He just told them about the location of the girls' bodies, what he knew about the location from what the group had told him. Through speaking to Joe and Christina, the police were able to identify who exactly was involved in what had happened to Jennifer and Elizabeth, who was in this group, this gang. They obviously knew that Joe's brother, 18-year-old Peter Cantu, was involved, and according to sources, he was very much the leader of the gang. He was the one who called the shots. But there was also Derek Sean O'Brien, who was 18 years old. Most sources refer to him by his middle name, Sean. There There was Jose Medellin, who was also 18, 17-year-old Efran Perez, 17-year-old Raul Villarreal, and the youngest member of the gang was Jose Medellin's younger brother, Venancio Medellin, who I think also went by the nickname Uni, and he was just 14 years old at the time that this case took place. He was the same age as one of the victims, 14-year-old Jennifer Ertman. According to sources, a couple of these boys slash men had had brushes with the law in the past, I believe for mainly like low-level crimes. Apart from Peter Cantu, the leader of the gang, he'd been in trouble with the police a number of times before. He'd gotten in trouble in school a lot for being violent and assaulting other students and also a teacher. And apparently at the time this case took place, he was actually on probation for assault after he threatened another young person with a knife outside in a parking lot. But after the police received the account from Peter Cantu's brother Joe and his wife Christina, the police arrested all 6 men, all members of the gang, on suspicion of double murder. They were all questioned separately, and surprisingly, I believe all of them quickly admitted to being involved in the crime. They all admitted that they were there that night. However, as does happen in these kinds of cases where multiple people are involved, they were all very quick to try and place the blame on each other. A lot of them would say, oh yeah, I was there, but Peter was the one who did this, or Jose was the one who did that, and vice versa. But eventually, after speaking to all of the men and after going through the evidence, the police pieced this case together. They pieced together what they believed happened on the night that the girls were attacked and murdered, what each member of the gang did. And I just want to put a warning in here. What we're about to talk about is absolutely horrendous. What these vile men did to these poor girls is just pure evil. I'm not going to go into too much detail just because it is so disturbing, but I do still want to give a warning. If you do not want to listen to this part, there'll be a time on screen that you can skip ahead to. So on the night of the 24th of June 1993, Jennifer and Elizabeth left the party at their friend Gina's house, and as we know, they decided to take a shortcut back to Elizabeth's house because they were worried that they were going to miss their curfew of 11:30 p.m. So they decided to walk through TC Jester Park along the railway tracks when they encountered the 6 men, the gang. Now the gang were there that night because apparently they were holding a gang initiation test for 17-year-old Raul Villarreal. He was a new member and he wanted to join the Black and White Gang, which was the name that the group had given themselves. And so apparently he had to do an initiation whereby the other gang members had to beat him up, basically. He had to engage in a physical fight with several members of the gang, and then afterwards they would decide whether or not he could join. Apparently he fought with 3 members of the gang, and one of them actually knocked Raul unconscious during this fight. And then at the end of the initiation, the gang leader Peter Cantu said, quote, "You're in, dude, you're a badass, you're welcome to hang with us anytime." Following this, the gang just continued chatting, they were making jokes, they were drinking beer after beer after beer, until eventually 16-year-old Elizabeth Peña and 14-year-old Jennifer Ertman passed them as they were walking home. The gang didn't know the girls personally, they were strangers to them, and instead of just letting them walk along, one member of the gang, Jose Medellin, decided to sexually assault Elizabeth. He went up to her and he groped one of her breasts. Elizabeth immediately pushed Jose away, she pulled his hand off of her, and the 2 girls just tried to continue walking. However, Jose wouldn't just let them go. He said to Elizabeth, quote, "No baby, where you going?" And then he literally grabbed her around the neck. He put his arm around her neck, pushed her to the ground, and then he started dragging her towards to where the rest of the group were. Of course, Elizabeth was terrified and she was shouting and screaming for help, asking Jose to let her go. And Jennifer, having just witnessed this, was terrified too. Now, Jennifer hadn't been grabbed at this point. She easily could have made a run for it. She could have fled, but she didn't. She couldn't leave her best friend behind, and so she ran after Jose and tried to help Elizabeth escape. However, she too was quickly grabbed. She was apprehended by Peter Cantu and Sean O'Brien, and they threw her to the ground. Both girls were now trapped by these men. Following this, the gang forced the girls to remove their clothing and their underwear, and then every single member of the group proceeded to sexually assault and rape both girls. Even the youngest member of the group, 14-year-old Venancio Medellin, took part in this. According to one source, at first he just stood back and watched, but then as the rest of the gang were egging him on, he got involved too and started raping the girls. The men literally took it in turns to assault the girls. They would force them to perform oral sex on them, and they would constantly switch and go from Jennifer to Elizabeth and then back to Jennifer again and then Elizabeth. And as this was going on, the girls were begging the men, pleading with them to stop and just let them go. They were trying to fight them off. They were crying and weeping, but the men didn't care. They were having too much fun violating them to stop. The men raped and assaulted the girls for more than an hour until the leader, Peter Cantu, whispered to the rest of the gang that they had to kill the girls. He decided that they couldn't risk leaving them alive. The girls had seen their faces, so they could go to the police and then they would all be caught and arrested. So he basically said that they had no choice. They had to murder them, and the others agreed. So they grabbed both girls, walked with them to the entrance of the wooded area nearby, and there they began to strangle them. They tried to kill Jennifer first. Sean O'Brien and Raul Villarreal put a red nylon bout around her neck and they started to pull. However, the bout broke, and so instead they used a shoelace and they strangled her with it until they believed that she was dead. And Elizabeth had to watch this whole thing. She was forced to watch the group murder her best friend, knowing that the same was about to happen to her. She tried desperately hard to convince the men to spare her. She literally begged them for her life. She even said that she would give them her phone number so that they could meet up and get together after this. She was saying anything that she could think of, anything that she could to try and save herself, but the men weren't interested, and so she actually tried to make a run for it. Elizabeth got up and she tried to run away, but Peter Cantu tackled her to the ground and he began just kicking her all over her body. He actually kicked her so hard that he fractured her ribs and kicked out a couple of her teeth. He, Jose Medellin and Ifram Perez then looped a shoelace around Elizabeth's neck and they pulled it so tight until Elizabeth died. One source states that following Elizabeth's death, the men realised that Jennifer wasn't actually dead yet. She was still clinging onto life, and so to ensure that she would die, the men started just stomping all over her body, and they did the same with Elizabeth. They stomped all over her so that they could be sure that she was dead. Peter Cantu then proceeded to steal from the girls. He stole the jewelry that they were wearing, and as the men were leaving the scene, he handed a watch which had a picture of Goofy from Mickey Mouse on it. It was Jennifer's watch. He handed this watch to Venancio Medellin and said, quote, "Take this, I don't want it." Apparently he also divided out the rest of the jewelry too. Sources state that he gave Jose Medellin a ring that he stole from Elizabeth. It had the letter E on it, and Jose had a girlfriend called Esther, so Peter gave it to Jose so that he could give it to Esther. After leaving the scene, all 6 members went back to the Cantu house. Apart from Sean O'Brien, I think he just went back to his home, but the rest went to the Cantu house, and we know what happened from there. They told Peter Cantu's brother Joe and his wife Christina what they had just done. Apparently Joe and Christina noticed that some of the boys had blood on them, and so they asked them what had happened, where had that blood come from, and the men said that Joe and Christina would soon find out because it would be all over the news. They wouldn't really say too much to begin with. They just said that they, quote, had fun that night, and then eventually they started talking about what they did to Elizabeth and Jennifer, that they had raped and murdered 2 young girls. A couple of days days after this, as we know, Joe Cantu rang Crime Stoppers to let the police know where the girls' bodies could be found. And from this lead, the police were eventually able to piece this horrific case together. They went to the location that Joe had described, they found the bodies, and sickeningly, it turns out that one of the killers actually went to the scene when he found out that the police were there. If you remember from earlier, I mentioned how when the bodies were found on the 28th of June 1993 and the police cordoned off the scene, there were a load of onlookers standing nearby trying to find out what was going on. And one of these onlookers was Sean O'Brien. He was at the scene that day, just watching what the police were doing. Some sources even state that he was watching with a smile on his face. After tracing the phone call that Joe Cantu made and speaking to him and Christina, all 6 members of the gang were arrested and eventually charged with murder and also rape and robbery. I think the only one who wasn't charged with robbery was Raul Villarreal. I'm guessing he was the only one who didn't take any of the girls' belongings, any of their jewellery. As I mentioned earlier, I think most, if not all of the men actually confessed to the crime, and at the end of all of their trials and their court proceedings, they were sentenced, and most of them were actually sentenced to death for what they did. Peter Cantu, Jose Medellin, Sean O'Brien, Ertman Perez and Raul Villarreal were all given the death penalty. However, Ertman Perez and Raul Villarreal's sentences were later changed to just life in prison following the decision made by the Supreme Court that people under the age of 18 at the time that they commit their crime could not be given the death penalty. And Perez and Villarreal were both 17 at the time, so they were given a life sentence instead. The youngest member of the gang, 14-year-old Venancio Medellin, was sentenced to 40 years in prison. And by now, by 2023, the killers who received the death penalty have been executed. The first to be put to death was Sean O'Brien. He was executed by lethal injection on the 11th of July 2006, more than 13 years after the girls were murdered. Jose Medellin was executed 2 years later on the 5th of August 2008. He tried to appeal his sentence before he was executed, but his appeals were rejected and eventually he was put to death. And then Peter Cantu was executed on the 17th of August 2010. And Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents actually had to fight for their right to be there when their daughter's killers were executed. The law in Texas before their executions meant that relatives of homicide victims were not allowed to attend the killer's execution. But Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents wanted to be there. They wanted to see their daughter's murderers take their last breath. They wanted that closure, and so they had to fight for it. Randy Ertman in particular was very, very vocal in his advocacy for a change in the law, and thanks to his hard work, the law was changed to permit relatives of murder victims to witness executions. So the family were able to be there to watch all 3 men die. They watched Sean O'Brien, Jose Medellin and Peter Cantu be put to death. According to a few articles actually, Randy Ertman also fought for the right to be able to address his daughter's killers in the courtroom at the end of their trials and their court proceedings. I guess kind of like making a victim impact statement. I don't believe that was allowed before this case in Texas either, but Randy didn't think that that was fair. He felt that victims' families should be able to speak directly to the perpetrators once they are convicted and have their say. He really did become such a huge advocate for victims' rights following the death of his daughter. So yeah, 3 of the killers have been executed now, but as for the other 3 killers, Venancio Medellin, Ertman Perez and Raul Villarreal, they remain in prison to this day. Venancio Medellin has come up for parole. He's applied for parole numerous times, I believe, but every single time he has been rejected. According to one source, he is scheduled to be released sometime in 2034, so in about 11 years time. And that is it for this case. That is the case of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Peña. I've said it a few times in this video, I think, but an absolutely horrendous case. What those poor girls went through that night is just unimaginable. My heart breaks for them and for their families. It must have been literal hell for the families, having to come to terms with what these monsters did to the girls. I cannot tell you how many times I cried whilst researching this case. It's one of the worst that I think I've ever come across, and I just hope to God that the other 3 killers who are still in prison today are never released. I hope that they stay behind bars until they die, because the thought of them being released is just terrifying. But yeah, that is it for this case. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think. Also, feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel in 2023. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly.